Trusting News, if you guys aren't familiar, is a news organization. We've been working since 2016 to basically learn what kind of news people trust, and then turn that knowledge into day-to-day strategies that journalists can use to build trust with their audience. So a lot of our work is really focused on solutions. And so today we're going to be focusing a lot on solutions and strategies and actions that you as a journalist can do. But first, I want to start by posing a question to you all of, have you heard these sorts of comments about whether your journalism or another news organization? So one, that journalists maybe don't cover an issue because it might make an advertiser mad. That you only cover crime from certain neighborhoods, or cover crime from neighborhoods more than other neighborhoods because you want to make certain groups of people look like criminals. That you maybe cover one school's sports more than the other, maybe because your kid goes there, or because you're a fan of that school's sports, or because you're covering an issue just because it fits your political agenda. So some nodding heads here, I see. So these are all accusations or things that partner journalists that we work with have heard. They're things that I've heard throughout my time working in local newsrooms, and that is a bummer. It's really disheartening, right? I'm sure if you guys are here at this training, you're all ethical, mission-driven journalists who care deeply about getting it right. And I'm sure these things are assumptions that don't actually align with what you're trying to do with your journalism. But what it shows is that, again, the public is really paying attention to what kind of stories us as journalists are deciding to tell and not tell. And clearly we see from these misassumptions that if we're not explaining these story selection process, that people are making all sorts of assumptions about the motivation behind our coverage. So that leaves us with this question of, what can we as responsible, ethical, mission-driven journalists do? That's a lot where our work at Trusting News comes in. So since we started in 2016, we've been working in this continual cycle of learning with academic researchers and newsroom partners to figure out real, actionable, efficient, realistic strategies that journalists and news organizations can do to earn trust with their audiences. So some of the basic principles of our work is that, one, we can't persuade everyone to trust us. I think sometimes when we talk about building trust, a lot of people immediately jump to the most negative commenter on their Facebook page, right? And it's like, you kind of want to throw your hands up and be like, we're never going to earn that person's trust. And that might be true. There's some people who are just never going to trust us or never be fans of our news organization, and that's okay. But there's lots of people in the middle between the people who are the fans of our news organization and the people who might never trust us. And those are the people that we're really trying to reach. Understanding that being a news consumer is really confusing and overwhelming, and that a lot of people have casual relationship with the news. Again, a lot of people are not actively seeking out news information. They're kind of just seeing headlines that come to them, whether that's through the water cooler at work or through social media algorithms, right? Like, people have a very casual relationship with the news and often get really overwhelmed by the amount of news and all the different places where you can access news. Another principle is understanding that there's problems on both sides of our broken relationships with our audience, but as journalists, we really need to be part of owning this solution. Again, I'm sure there's lots of things that we wish our audience knew in terms of news literacy and understanding how news works. But again, we're the ones where this really is dependent on our news audience coming to us and trusting us. Our jobs are the ones who rely on it. So it's really on us as journalists to own this solution. Also understanding that not all journalism is good journalism. I'm sure we can all think of some journalism that we don't think is ethical or makes us kind of want to pull our hair out. And so it's totally rational and wise that other people are skeptical of the media as a whole. That's probably smart, right? There's some journalism that's just not good journalism. But what our job is to differentiate what our work is and what makes our work trustworthy and stand apart from the rest of this general media landscape. And also, like we saw at the top of this training, people make tons of assumptions about our motives and work. And so if we're not explaining what our ethics are, how we're being thoughtful about the decisions, how we're being thoughtful about our values and our coverage decisions, people aren't going to know those things, and they're probably just going to make really negative assumptions about the work that we're doing. So some of this work then involves humility and listening and engagement and responsiveness. So being in active relationship with our audience, hearing what they have to say, making sure our coverage is reflective of them. But a lot of it relies on transparency and clarity on the types of content, on where content comes from, and what our values are as a news organization. Ourselves and lots of other organizations have done research around this, and we know that it works. We know that when journalists explain the processes behind their work, when they are transparent with their audience, it usually builds trust with their news consumers. So this is a screenshot of some research we did with the Center for Media Engagement a couple of years ago, where we showed people two different stories, one just a regular story and another that had these explain your process boxes attached to them, which really went into the why this news organization was doing the story, how they were doing the story, and their approach to the story. And what we saw was that when there was this transparency language attached to the story and these explain your process boxes, that people overall had a more trustworthy view of the news organization, and that it boosted people's perceptions of that news organization. Here's another example from newsroom partners we work with, WCPO. They took a group of people who were somewhat familiar with the news station, but didn't know much about how the news organization functioned or worked, and they invited them into a morning news meeting. And what they learned was that prior to attending the meeting, a lot of people said they didn't know how stories were selected. They thought that a lot of the coverage decisions were made on a national level, not on a local level, and that all of the participants who attended this morning meeting had some sort of distrust of the general media. But after attending a morning news meeting, more than half of these participants said that they had a favorable or trustworthy view of the station. People said that they were really surprised learning about how many stories and story ideas that the local station had to navigate through on a daily basis. And then most participants said that they wanted to learn even more information. So they appreciated hearing some of the processes behind how the station made story selections, and they wanted to know even more about how journalists did their job and how the station functioned. So there are lots of different ways that journalists can be transparent and explain their processes. And today we're just going to be focusing in on one of them, which is a basic question that, again, is really foundational to our work and a work of a lot of journalists. And that's why are you covering or not covering a certain story? So there's lots of things that go into coverage decision. We're big fans of, if you can, explaining your overall approach to coverage. So, you know, how it is that you find story ideas, what beats you think are important, or maybe key topic areas for your news organization. There are a few instances when it's really important, or especially important, to explain your coverage decision. And that's when it's a topic that often leads to accusations or distrust in your newsroom. So that might be crime, political coverage, election coverage. When it's something that you don't normally cover, if you're covering something differently, so maybe you have two reporters covering something that only one reporter normally covers, or you're covering an arrest or a court case that you normally wouldn't cover because of certain circumstances. Again, we see our audience notices that, so that's why it's so important to get on the record and explain why it is that we're covering something differently. If a story raises a lot of questions or prompts discussion in the newsroom, so if maybe the staff is split on whether or not you should cover something or how you should cover something, that's a good indication that there probably is going to be questions on the community as well in terms of how you're covering it. Or if it's a controversial or polarizing topic in the community or the national media. These hot button issues tend to be, people tend to make assumptions again about our journalism and why we're doing those things. So that's a really good opportunity to get on the record to explain that you're just trying to give people the facts and not add to this polarizing dialogue. So now that we talked a little bit about when you should be explaining your coverage decisions, the meat of it is really what should those explainers look like? What sort of elements should be included in those explainers? And so the first is to really point to your mission and goals and tie your coverage into your overall organization's missions and goals. So whether you're working as an individual journalist or as a newsroom, really sharing how your mission and goals align with the coverage that you're doing. So here's an example of how a newsroom partner, WCPO, again, did this. So they took an overall approach of kind of explaining how they do coverage as a whole. They wrote this column and posted, again, where they get their story ideas. So some of that was that, you know, reporters have expertise in certain areas, that they get news releases, that they listen to Police Scanner, that they follow other media organizations, and that they also just live here, right? So they say, you know, sometimes we do just drive by something and it's interesting and it caught our attention, and that's why we decided to cover it. But what's really great, I think, about this explainer is that, again, they tie it back to their mission and goals as an organization. So they talk about how they want to serve as a watchdog in the community. They talk about how they're covering key topics that they know are of interest and reflect their community. Another element to explain is how you work to be fair and ethical. So if you're on the lookout for bias and you want to be accountable to your community, make sure to get specific about that and explain that to your audience. This is a great example from the Malheur Enterprise from Les Zates, who will be joining us here for a Q&A afterwards. So when they were getting questions about a shooting, but they weren't able to confirm the story, instead of just one, reporting unconfirmed facts, or two, not saying anything and just kind of letting it go by, which I think is what a lot of news organizations tend to do, right? If you can't confirm something, you kind of just wait to report on the story. Instead, they got on the record and explained why it was that they're waiting to report on this story. And what I thought was so great about this is that they really tie it to their ethics and how they do journalism. So they say, you know, our journalists are working to try to find accurate information. Our small team is working to separate fact from fiction, right? So just getting on the record that they care about accuracy and care about getting things right. This is another example from a newsroom partner, WITF, when they're publishing a story about critical race theory, which we know is a really contentious topic in both national media and in their local community as well. Instead of just kind of stoking the fire or letting people assume that they're adding to this polarizing dialogue, instead they just really, this editor's note really explains that in clear language how they just wanted to share the facts and help inform people so they could make their own decisions. Another element to explain is to share your commitment to the community. So again, most of us as local journalists view our job as a service to the community, and we want to provide coverage that uplifts our community while also holding people in power accountable, right? But again, we see from those misassumptions that news consumers make about our coverage decisions that most people don't think that or aren't assuming that. So that's why it's so important to really point to how we're trying to work on behalf of our community. This is another example from WCPO of how they did this. So when they were publishing an investigation about a law enforcement agency and some mishandling of things, they knew that when they published this story, they would get lots of reader complaints saying that they might be anti-law enforcement or anti-cop. So instead of letting those misassumptions fester, they just got on the record about why it was that they are covering this topic at all. So they talk about, again, their commitment to their community to be a watchdog and that they want to hold people accountable the same way that other people in the community would be held accountable. And they're saying that, you know, some law enforcement officials were not being held accountable in that way. And so that's why they were doing this story. Another is to acknowledge the complexity and nuance of coverage and that acknowledging that things might change. It's totally fair. Sometimes staffing just changes. Sometimes someone calls out sick or there's a breaking news situation, right? So this community event that you had planned to cover, you can no longer cover because you have limited staff and you have to divert some of that those resources elsewhere. Again, that's totally fair and totally fine, but people will make all sorts of assumptions about why it is that you aren't covering something unless you get on the record. So a really good first step with building transparency and establishing credibility is just getting on the record when those things change and just acknowledging when you might be short-staffed or might not have the resources to cover something, even if you would want to cover it as a news organization. One last element to include in these explainers is how you engage your audience and ask them to weigh in. So it's a really great if you can ask your audience for feedback. Maybe you can ask them if they have other story ideas or perhaps if they know of any voices that might be missing in the coverage. I really love this example from WUSA 9, which is a station in the DC area. If you guys have worked in breaking news, you know that there's just so many school threats that happen, and it can be really hard to parse through which ones are credible and which ones aren't, and which ones are worthy of reporting or not. And so instead of just letting this stay an internal discussion in their newsroom, they got on the record about it by posting on Twitter and just saying, you know, there's another school threat this morning. Our staff is split on how we should be covering these school threats, of whether we should be covering them or not. And then they simply ask their readers, like, we want your input. When should we report on these? When is it worthwhile? And invited people to share their thoughts with them. Again, sharing how you cover topics that often cause distrust. So again, for a lot of news organizations, this is crime, political coverage, elections, but, you know, thinking through the negative feedback that you get from your news organization, maybe it's another specific topic area. Here's a few examples of how newsrooms we've worked with have handled this. So the Coloradoan was getting lots of negative complaints about how they were doing their crime coverage. So instead of, again, letting those negative complaints sit there, they just got on the record and wrote a column explaining what their reporting process around crime looked like. They explained that it's a complex process and that, you know, there's no one size fits all model, but they do have a framework that guides their approach. And then in that column shared what that framework was. This is another example from WTXL when they decided to shut down their mugshot page. Again, this is something that a lot of news organizations are re-examining and perhaps doing, and is something that you might just do and not want to share with your audience or not explain it to them, but people will probably notice if all of a sudden your mugshot page goes away. So they wrote this column explaining why it was that they felt like it wasn't ethical to be posting these anymore and why they were changing their policy around how they publish mugshots. Similar to the shooting example we looked at on Facebook just earlier, a newsroom partner at the Burlington Free Press, when they were getting complaints about why they didn't cover a certain assault, they just got on the record about why it was that they didn't cover it, and again, shared their framework for their crime coverage and how they typically cover crime. Switching to elections, something that can just be a really good ahead of covering any sort of political cycle or election cycle is to just explain how you plan to cover it. So we really love this example from the Texas Tribune last year. They created this landing page to just that really got into depth of how they were going to cover certain races, how they were covering certain areas, how they were going to choose which races to cover, and just got on the record about that from the get-go. Here's another example from WCPO, getting really specific of how they cover presidential candidate visits. So ahead of presidential election, they knew that they would have lots of people coming through town. So instead of having to make the decision over and over again of how they would cover certain rallies, they just created a plan for themselves, shared it with their audience, and then when they get audience questions about why they maybe did or didn't cover certain rallies, they could point back to the explainer of how they were said they were going to be covering presidential candidate visits. So where can these explainers go once you've decided when you should get on the record, what should be included in your explainer? These explainers can pretty much go anywhere where you publish content. So like we saw, that could go in an editor's note, it could go in a social post, it could go in a column that's linked to from other stories, it could go in a newsletter or in an on-air segment, or arguably maybe the best place it could go is in the story itself. Again, that's where you have the most eyeballs and the most people's attention. So it's a great opportunity to just capitalize on the attention that you have in the story and add some coverage and transparency language there. So we just want to take a beat to acknowledge that we know that this work takes time and investment and is not something that is baked into a lot of newsrooms' routines and workflows, but we hope that you see the importance of explaining your coverage decisions, and hope taking you through the step-by-step process helps simplify it and showing you examples, gives you ideas of how you could get on the record about your own coverage decisions. We also have a new tool that we just launched last week called Trust Kits. We have one specifically on how to explain what you cover. And this is basically a guide that walks you through even more in depth than this training, the step-by-step process of getting on the record about your coverage decisions. So again, it goes more in depth about each of these steps and gives more newsroom examples and really walks you through this process. So we'll drop that link in the chat. Another resource that we have that can help is our Trust Tips newsletter. So every Tuesday, we send a short newsletter that's a quick actionable tip for how journalists can earn trust with their audience. This is a really good way if you're looking to build trust with your audience. Again, everything that we share there is really actionable. We also share a lot of our updates. So when we publish new Trust Kits or have new trainings, we'll share them there